Hi. If you don't mind, while we're waiting, sharing, pardon me, all these years with Zoom, I think we better. All right. If you could, give me a minute to put in, I think the Q&A box is open to share kind of what is your role working with students who are twice exceptional, parent, teacher, clinician, what have you, the ages of the students you're thinking about, and then what abilities or disabilities you might be thinking about, wanting to know more about. This is a big topic, and we'll try to tailor a bit where we can. Thanks. Great. All right. So I see a few people are starting to put some information in the Q&A box. If you're able to, if you want to, um, this is good for us to know what is your role. If there are certain ages or abilities or disabilities as that you're thinking of, we'll see if we can kind of target those ages and those I'm sorry, ages, abilities, and roles. And I know we're at 12 o'clock. We're expecting some more people. If you have an opportunity to share some information in the chat box, and we're also waiting for Dr. K to hop online. Busy morning. So probably starting just a couple minutes here. And thanks for the folks who want to share information about what is their role, what kind of, pardon for the people who've been sitting on here for a while, repeat myself. Special ed teacher, we were quite repetitious. Sharing information about kind of what kind of student or students are you thinking about, and what role are you thinking about when you're going into this presentation, and where we can, we'll try to consider the information that you're sharing as we answer questions. So we got a quite a smattering of different ages. Seems like more on the older end, sort of. Quite a variety of abilities and identified disabilities. And then quite a few different roles too, which is really great. And it's great we have a wide crowd. Yeah, so I think a lot of our comments might be a little bit on the older end, maybe. So I'm not seeing much younger than 8. So hopefully our conversations about what school supports makes sense will be appropriate. Okay. And okay, great. All right. Hey, Matt. Dr. K is just hopping on, and we've got a number of people who are joining us, sharing information about the kind of student they're thinking of, the role that they have, and maybe if how we can tailor our presentation. So we're seeing a lot of the comments are about slightly older kiddos. You can see, but you can't. Pardon me, and I'm just going to help Dr. K. I'm gonna hop off for just 1 second here, Dr. K, with some logistics here of meeting. 1 second, please. We are having technical issues. I apologize here. So let me see if I can make sure that Dr. K has the correct link. So my apologies here. 1 second, please. I'm so sorry to people who are the guests here, but I'm going to talk to Matt for a second here. Having a hard time with the link. I sent the one that we hopped on. Is there any reason why she shouldn't be able to use it? Maybe she doesn't have the right Gmail account or something?
No, it's on our calendar. It went out to everybody who was signed up.
I think she's signing in as a guest, not as a presenter.
Well, I don't know what was sent, but why don't you send her the link that you've got?
Yep, I did. Asked her to try again. Now it asked me for, okay. We're still working on it. 1 second here. So sorry. All right, hopefully we got it working. I'll go back to sharing my screen, please. All right. So for the, again, and as Matt, as I was starting to share here, so the guests are sharing that quite a few ranges of ages, quite a few types of disabilities, a number of parents, a couple of clinicians, but it seems like on the whole, a little bit on the older end. So as much as we can be mindful of that, that'd be great. And for anybody else who wants to share what ages you're thinking about for the students you're thinking of, what abilities and disabilities, what your role is. Okay, so we got a question here. Oh, Matt's answering. Matt, can I share your answer out loud?
Yeah.
Okay. Or do you mind just sharing your answer out loud? I can say the question.
Sure.
All right, so the question is there any research you can point to that supports the needs for 2E kids to be supported appropriately, i.e. outcomes when supported versus not?
Well, Beth, you may have a better reaction or information about that, or the doctor would. I don't have information on research, though it's certainly borne out by my practical experience. The answer I was typing to Sarah was in response to her second question, which is, are there settings that can support both kids who are oppositional or acting out and have exceptionality in terms of being gifted simultaneously? And the answer to that is, at best, in my experience, the schools may have an adequate general ed curriculum that's tied to grade level, but tend not to have any programming that's geared to giftedness. The closest program that would come to that is the Orthogenic School, which is a day school in Hyde Park, which does have some orientation to individualized programming at a higher level, but certainly it would not describe itself as a program for gifted or TUI kids. But most of the programs that deal with behavior or emotional problems tend to shoot low rather than high.
And that's, again, hopefully we can figure out the logistics when Dr. Kate joins us. That's a lot of what the work that she does and the research that she's doing is looking at what in particular do students who are twice exceptional, what do they need and what are their, how to meet their unique needs most appropriately. Hey, there's a Dr. K.
I just hit allowed to talk in our guest list, Beth, so she's signed in as a guest, not as a presenter, but
okay, all right.
Hopefully can participate now.
Okay, wonderful.
Right. I don't think you can see me though.
No, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm asking our office manager who is on vacation to help with this, and I don't think that's going to happen. So is it okay if we just hear your lovely voice, Dr. K? I'm so sorry for, and all of our guests, I'm sorry for the truncated presentation here.
Yeah, it's fine with me.
Okay. And Dr. K, we've had some people been sharing some information about, who they are and the ages that they're thinking of. A lot of 8 to about 15, a number of different disabilities and abilities, and a number of parents and a couple of clinicians here.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone. Thanks for making time for us today.
And for the sake of our time, if you could continue to put your questions and thoughts into the Q&A box, that would be great, just because we have 3 people here and not a lot of time. So I'm going to scoot on to the next thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. I am currently an advocate with Matt Cohen and Associates. I've been, okay. And Dr. K, thank you. I gotcha. I'll help you with that. I apologize. So I'm an advocate with Matt Cohen and Associates. I have been in education for a very, very long time. I started off as a general education teacher, then moved into special education, taught pretty much every age in a lot of different capacities, but mostly inclusion. And then I moved to private advocacy. I did that for a number of years. And then I've had the privilege of working with Matt and our team for about 8 years now. And I don't know if you can see the bizarre the little letters behind me, but those are a lot of acronyms and such for the executive functioning coaching that I get to continue to do. So I get to keep teaching, which is just a real thrill. Dr. K, do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Hi, sure. I'm Dr. Lane Cobb-Fleisch. I'm an educational psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist. I have a practice called TUI Consults LLC. And I work with families and children with twice exceptionalities. I work across the lifespan, and my services include things like psychoeducational evaluation, social skills and assistive technology training, staff development and trainings for behavioral health teams and teachers. It's good to be here today. Thank you.
All right. So we're hoping to touch on a lot of things, and our time is going to fly, so we might not get to all of this, but this presentation will also be available on our website. So if we don't get to some slides, they'll be there as well. We're going to talk about the difference between giftedness and being twice exceptional, the implications of an Illinois law, the Accelerated Placement Act. How do you identify twice exceptional kids? The typical educational, the educational plans that are available through schools, what what they are and what's the difference. This can be a very high level conversation because that's a meaty conversation there. And then just a executive function and assistive technology, because that's often a good place to help level the playing field and address twice exceptional needs. It seems like it's a common theme, and then some resources that we have. I'm gonna keep scooching here. So this is a very involved slide here. And again, I'm gonna highlight a couple of points here, but gifted means you could have a disability, but you don't. Twice exceptional means you do. So basically, if we're thinking about the bell curve, right? And you've got average, where these are the kiddos, and Dr. Key, if I'm getting any of this wrong, please do correct me, but these are the kiddos who are on the outskirts on either ends. I love my hat here. So one of the big distinctions too is that gifted programming doesn't have, an accelerated program does not have a funding stream. So unlike IEPs where students need remediation and specialized instruction, there is money that comes outside of the district that can fund it and support. So it's a funded mandate, which it means that there's more resources usually behind what those programs can offer. Evaluations, just going to kind of maybe hit on this one. So, oh, so sorry. When we're talking about eligibility, there's no clear line for what you need to have for the accelerated piece. However, for special education, you do need to fit one of the eligibility categories. And assessment should be multifaceted and include a number of different types of data points. One thing I also want to emphasize is that unlike for twice exceptional kids, the IEP and 504 part, again, the remediation piece, you have procedural rights and safeguards. On the gifted piece, we were saying, we need acceleration, we need more instruction. There is no mechanism to push back on that, other than possibly internal district policies. So that's a big one, right? It can be, you don't have a lot of push behind that, which is tricky. So again, knowing what your district policy is very helpful. So I'm going to scoot to the next slide, which talks a little bit about a little bit more teeth that Illinois gave families who are looking for acceleration for their students. So again, giftedness is not a disability under IDEA or 504. So you're not going to get legally binding supports through those plans if you're gifted. However, there is a law in Illinois that if students can get accelerated through the type of coursework that they're doing. So again, kindergartners can skip kindergarten and go to first grade. And it doesn't have to be for a whole grade. It can also be for subjects. So again, you can have students who both need, and we'll get a little bit more into this, both need acceleration for a topic, for a concept, at the same time, remediation for maybe a different topic. And again, there's no clear line for the students who require or should get accelerated placements, but it should, and I'm bolding some words here, available to children who would benefit, who have high ability and would benefit. And again, we're looking at multiple sources of information to make these decisions. Let me keep going here. All right, Dr. K.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So a twice exceptional student has, as you know, high strengths and high weaknesses. And when a student with a disability like ADHD or autism or dyslexia also has a lot of what I call natural resources, it impacts how they express their skills. And of course, it also impacts their behavior. So I think Elizabeth mentioned earlier, they're out on the ends of the bell curve. So the assumption is there are fewer of them, but I think the assumption that we should make sure that we jettison is that that they are no less important. These minds, in my opinion, are the minds that will take hard problems if they are supported and do amazing things as functioning adults. So that's my informal definition of 2E.
Shall I?
Yep.
Am I going, Dr. K?
So there are a lot of issues with identifying students with twice exceptionality, and of course, when there is a diagnosis, then it's also petitioning that that diagnosis is properly accepted. I work on both sides of the the aisle. I do independent evaluations for families who know that their kids are not being served and know that there are things that haven't been well enough defined or identified or named to help them. But I also, do that for school districts who have really tough cases and say, we haven't figured this kiddo out, and what are we missing? So identification can be tricky, but if you just go by the psychometrics and the numbers, you're looking at the distances between skills. And, something that I see a lot, I see highly gifted kids with high verbal IQs, 130, 140, but their rapid naming skills or their phonological awareness might be average or might be deficient. And so we can technically say that's a student that has what we call stealth dyslexia because they have a high verbal IQ. And yet when you look in the engine systems of the brain, the language processing, and we'll talk a little later about working memory and processing speed, they don't match. They don't match how easily information comes in. So the identification process is, on the surface, it's a kiddo that takes in information at a sophisticated level, but can't reproduce it in basic ways. And then there may be behavioral issues that mask that or support that, or one thing cancels the other thing out. So identification, we could talk for hours about, but I think we're getting to a place where we have ways forward psychometrically and neuropsychologically to make things possible for kids that are functioning this way.
Hey, Dr. K, do you mind saying a little bit more about self-concept for the students, for the twice exceptional students, and if that has anything to do with to inform how you identify a twice exceptional student?
Sure. I mean, definitely when a student is old enough to self-report on their own executive functioning, on their own anxiety levels, on their own self-concept, it's always informative because you can tell if a kiddo is being completely candid about themselves. You can tell if they're compensating in their responses. And that's always really helpful to see because the self-report may or may not match what a parent or a teacher sees from the outside in. And when there are those differences, it's helpful to be able to tell a person, a parent or a teacher, hey, that kiddo looks spot on with that executive function, but they are devoting a ton of energy into compensating. And so you should understand, where does their energy go? It's going to that particular skill or set of skills. So the self-reporting when kiddos are old enough is really important, an important part of the discussion. So in the neurology of twice exceptionality, there are things that research has been able to show. We know just a very basic few things about these kinds of brains. Some of it, it's hard to convince funders that there are enough people to be studied like this, and that when you find them, that you can actually see patterns among the differences, because twice exceptional people are so idiosyncratic. But while I had a research laboratory at an fMRI laboratory, and so we were able to make some gains on knowledge about 2E kids. We know that gifted students, when they are involved in accessing, using their strengths and their talents, that their brains don't become less active, they become more active. And that's important because part of skill is automaticity. And there are parts of the brain that may become very quiet and efficient, but when there is something like a piano concerto being played or a complex science problem being solved, what functional MRI has been able to show us is that people who have a ton of natural resources, in their skills, that they're using more of their brains in those moments. This is important because the left brain, right brain discussion is a popular way to talk about abilities and differences in abilities. But from a neural point of view, we find that if there is giftedness involved, that the whole brain is involved in stewarding those skills and what students are able to do. We also know that when kids are born, and in early childhood, one of the developmental things we know happens is that children are born with more gray matter in their brains than they need, and that there's a process called pruning as they begin to learn basic skills where the neurons that aren't necessary kind of fall away, and the pathways begin to form. But we know that in students who have above a 121 IQ on a WISC, that the frontal lobes of their brain are maturing in a different way than other children who are measured at appropriate levels of skill and ability, and even kids who are high average in their skills. There is something about brains with superior levels of ability that their frontal lobes have a different presence and different patterns of gray matter, and they sculpt a little bit differently. What we don't know is what are the practical consequences of that? Can we teach to that? Well, not exactly yet. We can't do that, but it is useful to know that at a baseline anatomical level, that those brains do have differences. And then the pieces that my research has focused on is when you have these conditions, we know that there are natural strengths and we know that there are weaknesses and that kids get different combinations of these. So we looked briefly at children who were high functioning on the autism spectrum and their executive functions. And what we were able to see is that when kids have certain verbal strengths, that there are executive functions that are also stronger. And that gives us ways to think about how do we bridge the self-knowledge and understanding that kids in autism may have so they can analyze their behavior all day long, but they don't know how to apply it. And so we think about, well, how do we do that? And it's going back into some of the strengths that we saw emerge in executive functioning with kids who were highly verbal on the autism spectrum.
And I'll talk a little bit more later about executive functioning in particular, because it does play usually such a large role.
Exactly.
Right, because they're just developing very differently. But and I'll try to weave in some ideas here that you're just, Dr. K, it's always great to talk to you. But the role of the self-rating as you're looking at assessing for executive functioning, and then the role of learning like a student understanding their own learning styles and
Right.
really honing in on compensatory strategies like assistive technology and the connection with speech and language. There's a lot of speech and language pathologists that are getting hip to the role of language.
Right.
Executive
Yep, it's very important.
Okay. Right. And if I got it right, to kind of help self-regulate, right? That the role, that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That's self-talk, right?
Right.
Oops, that's not right. There we go. All right. That's you, man.
So this slide just gives you a few touchstones on characteristics of twice exceptional kids. They can be very sensitive to feelings, to emotions, and even to the physical environment. In gifted education, these are sometimes talked about as excitabilities, but I've found in the assessment world that sensory processing gives us a lot of clues about what it's like to be that young person in any environment. And it's a key part of the discussion because the internal pieces of their intellect and their executive functions, of course, are already present inside of them and developing. But every day, those bodies, minds, and brains are walking into environments that may or may not be supportive physically, emotionally, intellectually. And the dials on their sensitivity are turned up. So that's a key piece when we're thinking about gifted kids that are twice exceptional.
I'm gonna move.
Mm-hmm.
And just to highlight that there is no law in Illinois that's talking about the qualifications, or pardon me, pardon me, there is no law that recognized that exceptional piece, the twice exceptional piece, I apologize. And that there needs to be a medical label or diagnosis for twice exceptionality. However, again, for the special education, you do need to have a label, not necessarily a diagnosis, but you do need to fit into one of the 13 eligibility categories. So that is a distinction between the two characteristics.
So one of the ways that we're often looking at twice exceptional kids, we're looking for clues about that exceptionality. And one of the clues lies in differences that may be present between their intellectual ability or their aptitude, or what I like to call their natural resources, and their school achievement. And of course, behaviorally, we see evidence of that where they can verbalize concepts and do sophisticated analyses, but they can't write that down at the same level of sophistication. They may have dysgraphia. They may be young and those skills are not well enough developed yet, but their minds are highly developed. So in testing, we're really doing a subtraction. Okay, if they have a high skill here, they have a natural ability, but they can't show it. That's going to show up in levels of school achievement. So states and even school districts have different definitions. I've seen standard deviations as large as 42 points required to identify a disability. And there are so many threads of that discussion, and there really isn't a consensus. So you have to go by kind of where you are, what your district may articulate, what your state may articulate.
And Illinois, we don't have a definition. And again, as we're sharing that there are other states do have definitions, but this is an ongoing challenge. And this idea of the deficit, achievement gap, schools no longer have to consider, which makes it much more difficult to identify that student who is very gifted and is showing a gap with their academics, a significant gap, right? 50 percentile, right? That second bullet. But a lot of schools are going to say, well, look, they're scoring average, 50 percentile. And so usually that approach is, you look more at how does a student respond to intervention? Like, does that get them caught up? But part of the challenge continues to be, maybe they're just continuing to score average on some of those metrics, when again, their abilities are far exceeding that. Sometimes what you can do is kind of talk about some of those less, I say softer skills, I apologize if that's an incorrect term here, but a little bit harder to quantify, like again, the self-concept, anxiety, behavior. So some more of the impact that this discrepancy, this difference, this dissonance is having on students. We could talk about, look at the effect. And then that is an indicator that the student needs more support. Do you agree with me, Dr. K? Okay. Moving down, but yeah, it's the response intervention model has been helpful in many regards in terms of not over identifying students with disabilities, but it's also made it very hard for students who are much harder for students who are bright and have lower and have disabilities, but they're just harder to see because their intellect masks them. Let's see if I can do this correctly. All right.
So this slide is about more of what we see in the psychometric or the neuropsychological domain. It's a very common pattern, probably the most prevalent pattern that I see, that those natural resources, those numbers might be nice and high for verbal processing, visual spatial processing, and fluid reasoning. But then if we look at the engines underneath that natural potential, we look at working memory and processing speed. And
Dr. K,
yeah,
I'll interrupt you. Could you not take just a second and just describe what a working memory and process speed is, just to make sure everybody's on the same page? Sorry.
Sure, that's where I was going next. So you could think about working memory like eating a pizza. I often talk to kids about this, and and their parents, that it's how much information your mind can grab onto at one moment in the service of solving a problem. People with high levels of working memory can eat the whole pizza at once. People with low working memory need to take smaller slices of information, pieces at a time. And these are often what those accommodations look like. Break it down, make a checklist, repeat certain expectations. And so working memory is how much can you handle at once, and how well do you think your brain multitasks? And of course, that's a huge myth. We don't multitask well, but our society and our technology allow us to do better at it. But we aren't neurologically made to multitask that well. And then processing speed is simply, well, how quickly is that mind moving? And low processing speed internally can be great for problem solving, because it allows a person to hang on to information longer, which allows it to incubate longer and may lead to creative insights or good analytical thinking. But when you are on a schedule and moving along on work product, low processing speed is, kind of sticky. So when you have a twice exceptional kiddo, that may be the paradox of what you see, that they can absorb information very quickly and easily, but bringing it back out in making product, their working memory and processing speed, those pathways are narrower than the rest of the way their brain works naturally. Within a WISC, the General Ability Index is a better measure of natural aptitude, because it divides that potential aside from the processing engines of the brain, aside from working memory. It doesn't matter how big of a piece you can take at a time. It doesn't matter so much as fast as your brain goes. So it's a nice way to get a look at what a gifted mind is really made of. But then again, in research, in the law, in schools, there isn't a consensus about what twice exceptionality is. And so you kind of have to start at the beginning every time by giving the basic definition and building that case neuropsychologically, legally. I call it threading the needle. You have to be able to follow the line of the logic and defend it in a way that people understand what you might understand about this young person. So these are all common twice exceptionalities that come through a child who might be gifted. Of course, in school, the ones that pop up probably most prevalently are attention disorders, autism spectrum, and generalized anxiety, also aspects of dyslexia. And dyslexia, that field has a great research base. And so we know there are different kinds of dyslexia that can be named and compensated for. Without that diagnosis, when schools are struggling with just looking at external behavior, if they don't have those touchstones of knowing how bright a child is, knowing that there's a formal diagnosis, it makes it very hard to serve them. And I often talk about how an attention deficit, the behavior looks the same on the surface, but there are many different roots of that. It could be emotional trauma. It could be boredom. It could be classic low dopamine in that brain. It could be many number of things that are very different from one another. And so if you don't get the right root, there isn't a way to help that person develop and go forward as a learner.
Mm-hmm.
So just a little bit about my work in autism from this slide. And the best way to conceptualize a brain with autism, the most neutral definition that I pose is that a brain with autism is simply a brain with a sensory cortex that tries to do everything. When we are born, we are sensory beings first. Those are the first processes in the brain that begin to develop. And an autistic brain simply holds that kind of development for a smidge longer in developmental timing. So that brain, as the frontal lobes are trying to start to develop executive functioning, the sensory cortex kind of holds and says, well, we can do everything. We're going to do the job of the whole brain. And development will capitulate that. So eventually, the connections that are growing from the back of the brain to the front, the white matter tracts, everything is developing, but just because of that pause where the sensory cortex is trying to receive everything and drive everything, it means that those connections just go to slightly different places at slightly different times. And that is the most neutral definition that I can come up with to talk about what autism really is to families and teachers so that they can start to really see it for what it is, that the external behaviors of stimming or sensory overload are merely happening because that cup is narrower than most people's. The brain hasn't distributed the function. It's processing through the sensory cortex. So that allows us to say, oh, well, no wonder they overload more easily, emotionally and physically. And if we know that, then of course we can make accommodations in the physical environment. We can give those kids the ability to move and express in appropriate ways when they need to. What's their exit plan? Who are they going to? Where are they going to? In twice exceptionality, it allows us to get the behavior in check so that we can focus on what their intellects know how to do. And then from my research from 2011, published in Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, we see a pattern where kids that have high verbal IQs on the autism spectrum, that they have some executive function strengths. They can monitor their mental planning. Those are the toeholds that we can use to help weaker skills develop. So it starts to give us a bit of a roadmap about what autism is instead of just looking at it from the outside in.
And if I can just chime in a little bit there with the students, and again, Dr. K, I'd love to hear if you have thoughts about this, but the students that I have the privilege of working with that are twice exceptional and with autism, their insights are phenomenal. I mean, granted, I have given structure for the input and then particularly for the output of their language.
Right.
Man, the student I've been working with, actually, he's in college now. He was in 7th grade, and again, the processing speed, it takes a very, very long time with language and structure. But man, when he speaks, the insights of what he has about what his brain and his body is doing are phenomenal, right? And my experience as an advocate is that when a student is able to speak about their own experience, it's very hard to refute. Right? You're going to say, no, that's not what's great. Okay, right. Like you can't say that's not what's going on in your brain, kid. Well, who's going to say otherwise, right? That student, if given that they have an ability to be self-aware and a comfort to express that, right? Because some students, right, they're not necessarily very forthcoming because of that self-concept, because of that dissonance, because maybe they're not certain that they're on strong footing when they're saying these things. Like, what are the implications of me saying this? That be correct?
Right. Well, sometimes when, kids are able to narrate their internal life, and in my 2E kids with autism, many of them, when something goes awry, and you do a debrief after the fact, they can wax poetic about their own behavior, and they can identify the roots of their anger or frustration. And so that may lead practitioners to say, oh, they're okay because they know, they're aware of what they're doing, and we're just going to try to shore them up from the outside in. But that's actually exactly where the weakness is, that intellectually and analytically, they're very connected and can narrate their inner states and analyze their inner states. But in that moment where things are really unfolding in real time, they can't access that knowledge. They can't access that awareness. That's where the social blindness is. And so the trick for intervention is saying, if they can be that self-aware after the fact, how can we develop ways to make them that self-aware when things are happening in real time? And it's exactly, that's the point of intervention for a twice exceptional kiddo on the spectrum.
Let me to another thought, if I may, here, Dr. K, where schools often want to categorize a skill, particularly if we're talking about behavior, as either performance or a skill deficit. Often I see that the students who, again, if they're able to explain it when they're reviewing, or they can rattle off again when they're regulated and in a calm and calm environment, and they feel comfortable and calm.
Right.
Then there's this idea of, well, then it must be a performance deficit. You're just, and again, underlying that, there's a certain element of, well, you're just choosing not to do it, right? Just do it, right? When I believe, Dr. K, you were describing my experience is that is a skill to know when and why and how to apply that strategy. And I argue that requires explicit instruction.
It does. Knowing that it's there, you can give a child the confidence that, kiddo, you know this. You always know this after the fact. The goal, what we want to do, we want to be able to help you understand it right when you need it, right when you need that information. And the difference between a 2E kid on the spectrum and one with hyperactivity is that kiddos with autism are kind of naturally more interested intrinsically of themselves. They'd rather spend time in their imagination than paying attention to 5011 stimuli happening around them, because they're sensitive. Kids who are hyperactive kind of are naturally more tuned to everything that's going on around them. So they may not have that same level of self-awareness. And that's a different intervention path.
It's a nice segue to the next slide too.
Yeah. Yeah. So in my research on twice exceptionality, kids with ADHD, an attention deficit is a brain that pays attention to everything. Not that they're taking in information faster than they can accommodate it. And they don't necessarily have that. If it's a classic attention deficit, the dopamine in their brain isn't circulating at a level that allows them that filter to differentiate between relevant information and irrelevant information. And yet their minds have enough might and will to command that focus. We call that hyper focus, where they can fall deeply into something that's interesting to them. And as long as they're productive, that can be that's one of the intellectual gifts of having high IQ and an attention deficit. But one of the best skills that they tend to have naturally is they will see far-reaching associations among things. Metaphors and analogies come much more easily to them, which allow their minds to collapse complexity of certain kinds of information and just absorb it. Tending overload of somebody who's hyperactive, the physical outlets in nutrition are the kind of the easy reaches. How can I shift that kiddo's neurochemistry? Is their medicine washing out? Maybe they need some tryptophan promoting food, banana, peanut butter, nuts, cheese, something like that. Maybe they need some fresh air for 10 seconds. But if you're really looking closely at a twice exceptional child with ADHD, the magic for them and the magic for a teacher, if you can accommodate this, is to allow their process to be their product. To allow oration, video, art, movement, anything that isn't sitting down and writing an answer that will never reflect the sophistication of their mind, letting that sense of motion and process become their product. You're going to get a much closer read from an assessment point of view of what they know and can do.
We have a question here, Dr. K, I want to get you, but if I can just glob, boy, you could just be here all day, Dr. K. When you're talking about metaphors and analogies, man, oh man, do I find that that is a motivating, fun way for a lot of my students who are twice exceptional to study. And fortunately, because unfortunately, right, some of those more kinesthetic, multi-sense or, multiple intelligence approaches to learning don't always jive in a public school or many school settings. However, making connections is something that schools promote. And again, it allows for a lot of creativity, a lot of fun.
Right.
And boy, does that stuff stick. And it's a lot, boy, it's just not as hard to get students to be engaged because it's fun and creative. And as Dr. K, as you said, it's their own, right? It's their own product. Yeah. So it's coming from them. And that's much more interesting. And again, it sticks. And those strategies work forever. Pardon me for interrupting.
No, if I could tell a quick story. So before I became trained in psychology, medicine, and education, became a doctor, I taught middle school and worked with middle school teachers and students. And I had a teacher when I was in teaching in public school who really didn't believe in or buy into this whole twice exceptionality conversation. And this was back in the late 90s. And at the end of the year, we were on the same middle school team, and she came back to me because she had one student in her class that was hyperactive and had an IQ in the clouds. And she said, all right, I'll give it to you. She said, I cannot get him to complete his diorama of King Tut's tomb, but he elevates the level of discussion in my classroom beyond any student I've taught in 30 years. And that is, in a nutshell, that's a twice exceptional kiddo who's hyperactive.
Goosebumps. We have a question here. How do we talk to teachers about separating fluency deficits caused by low working memory from level of content? I'm going to take a stab at it first, if that's okay, Dr. K. I think you want to stress the executive functioning piece, right? You can talk about doing an evaluation, and that can include rating scales such as the brief or the CEFI that can be completed by the school, the family, clinicians, and the student. So it's a great way to get insights into how does it feel? How do you feel like you're doing with initiating? How do you feel like you're doing with holding information in your head and then spitting it out? Right. And then that's a way to track. And you can also, if you're able to, look at the error analysis of the patterns, right? Of the work, right? If it's short and quick, and then they're effective and they're accurate then, and able to engage then, well, that gives an indicator that they have the underlying skills. But maybe if it gets to a longer problem, there are more words, there are more steps, and then it starts to fall apart. Well, that could be an indicator again of that working memory and holding on. How many pieces, how big should that slice of pizza be, right? That maybe that slice of pizza needs to be a little smaller, and some phenomenal strategies for that. You can also play around with, let's implement an accommodation or an instruction and see if that made a difference. So for instance, step-by-step written directions, right? You don't have to hold it in your head. You can just look, and that's a great way to make sure that you're practicing the correct process, strengthening that neural pathway, if I'm saying that correctly, Dr. K, and making sure that, again, you're not floundering and all over the place, and you have the confidence to make sure that you're doing it correctly. This is an accommodation I often advocate for in schools with varying degrees of success. A lot of teachers see it as a heavy lifting to write down a couple of steps, and it's often not. But I have a resource that I like a lot. It's IXL Math. There is a free version, and then there's a paid for version. But this is, if you make a mistake, if you scroll down, it gives you step-by-step directions. And so given the student's ability, I ask them to record it and look at they're empowered to make their own step-by-step directions. But yes, I think you want to go at it from the executive functioning piece. Dr. K, do you have any insights about that?
Sure. Let me add to that. A really practical tool is to use something from learning psychology called Bloom's taxonomy. And for every parent listening, teacher, if you don't know what Bloom's taxonomy is, Google it. A million renderings of it will come up. And what it is it's scaffolding the complexity of knowledge. You know, you have to know your basic vocabulary in order to apply what you know. If you're applying what you know, you have to be able to analyze it for its parts. You have to be able to understand it to synthesize your knowledge and make something creative and novel. And then after that, you have to be able to evaluate it. So I often coach teachers and motivated parents with homework to say, you know, find the visual of Bloom's taxonomy with definitions and action verbs to your liking. And for a gifted kiddo, instead of building from the bottom, do you know it? Can you apply it? Can you be analytical, creative? Start on the top and do a little bit of fun pre-assessment just through basic questions. Do you understand it enough to evaluate it? Or is the assignment that you're struggling with analytical in nature? Or are you being asked to do something creative, which your brain will really like once you get the hang of it? So Bloom's taxonomy and the many renderings you can find on Google that give the action verbs associated with each of those levels. It's a really quick tool to sit down with a 2E kid to figure out where they are on the taxonomy. Always assume going from the top down, higher level, so that they're reaching back for the pieces that they need. It isn't going from the assumption you got to learn it first, then apply it. That's what we tend to do to 2E kids in schools. If they can't do the basics, I'm not going to let them do the complex stuff. So working Bloom's taxonomy from the top down, that's what I recommend.
Getting a little bit into some of the educational plans that are available. And someone asked, I know I said it very fast, the different executive functioning rating scales. The BRIEF, BRIEF, CEFI, CEFI. I should know, I can't remember off the top of my head what they stand for. It's an acronym. So I got a slide with a lot of different columns here, but to put it in a nutshell, the big difference is in specialized instruction. 504 plans, you can get a lot of things. Usually you don't get goals in a 504 plan, but I've seen some districts do that. But the distinction is that you require working with a special education teacher. Sometimes it could also be a speech and language pathologist, and a couple other like one small related services counts, but you would not get an IEP. Adaptive physical education is considered a special education, but adaptive physical education is where you teach a student to be better with PE skills, and I have never seen a student get an IEP to teach adaptive PE skills. But again, mostly we're looking at, again, a speech and language only IEP, but typically it's working directly with a special education teacher. That makes the difference between an IEP or 504. So if you are working with the team and the student is extensively working or is working regularly with a special education teacher under RTI, MTSS. I'm so sorry, so many letters in special education. RTI is response to intervention. A lot of schools now call it MTSS, multi-tiered support system, something to that effect. Basically the idea of let's give some help before we qualify a student for a special education. However, there are some more distinctions here. Sorry, it's a lot. I'm not going to go over a lot of this because I know our time is going by really fast here. But as I mentioned, one of the big differences again in an IEP, and that third column is requires specialized education. You need to fit into one of those 13 categories. And if I can scroll down, pardon me here. It's hard to see the bottom here. Oh, it's really hard to see the bottom. I'm sorry. I see that's better. But there are 504 plan is an unfunded mandate. So typically there's less resources behind it. There's going to be a 504 coordinator, but they usually wear several hats in a school. Like they're the guidance counselor, the social worker. They do several things. And typically a special education teacher, the most of their job is going to be working in special education. I mean, I did RTI and MTSS, but mostly my job was making sure that the minutes are met and case management. One more thing I want to highlight is that procedural rights and safeguards. Like I said, for acceleration, there are none. Okay. But there are for 504 plans. You've got OCR, due process for a 504 plan, and then you've got due process for IEPs. They're a different process. Facilitated IEPs, this is where if you're, really want to work things out with the school and you're still at that place, someone from the state can come in and just kind of help things move forward, right? Help the team. And sometimes just somebody else there keeps people on their better behavior, right? And a little bit more polite, a little bit more respectful, a little bit more listening. Mediation, but please note that that is a voluntary experience. The district can decline to enter into that. And then due process, that is not a voluntary experience. The district is obliged to participate in that. It is very involved. It's like a little mini trial. And usually parties, and definitely the state, want you to try to avoid that and work it out with the district so they can give you some leverage, right? Nobody wants to go to hearing, and let's try to work things out. All right, move on to the next one here. I want to make sure I'm checking in our, pardon me here. We've got another question here. Oh, and we've got another resource here. And Dr. K, I don't know if you know this one, the Barkley Deficits in Executive Functioning was another rating scale that was thrown out as an idea. B as in boy, D as in dog, E as in elephant, F as in Frank, S as in Sam. We got a question here. What are your thoughts when schools and teachers recommend full grade acceleration for twice exceptional kids? Dr. K, you want to start on that one?
Sure. I see that recommended so rarely that when it is, I think it's always good to try with the conditions that who is that kiddo socially and emotionally, and what setting are they being accelerated into? If it were purely just the infusion of more sophisticated knowledge, that might be simpler, but learning happens in a social environment. So if the acceleration is recommended, there's a superlative intellect there, and that is always a need. But I think it's always important to think about, now that we all agree, in a committee, in an eligibility, in an IEP, we all agree this person needs to be accelerated because they need access to that content. But how they access that content, that can look very different. And that's kind of where the rubber hits the road in a recommendation like that. So highly contextual, highly situational, but it should always bring along the concerns of the social and emotional person, as well as that really wickedly smart brain.
And just as a quick time check here, we're at about 1 o'clock. I know we started, so I think we're going to go to about 1:15, if that's okay for you, Dr. K.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to share a little bit about do you want me to talk about this? Do you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm going to highlight just a few things here. So I'm going to skip to, I'm going to talk about that first one. So gifted in math, and then is dyslexia in reading. So again, you could be accelerated in math and then get accommodations. Maybe you're getting or instruction like Wilson in reading. But here's the other piece you need to be mindful of is the reading in math. So make sure that you're compensating for the reading components of math, like word problems, because students who are bright in math can start to show lowered scores and then have lowered opportunities because of those lowered scores and lowered perception because of the implications of their reading on their math abilities. So just again, think of the whole child, right? I think that's a lot of the message we're saying here. This twice exceptional kid is you got to think very holistically about their needs. And then I'm gonna scoot. We've got other things to talk about, but again, this slide is available. Here are a number of organizations in Illinois, and just in general, some resources to think about: executive functioning coaches, therapists, psychiatrists, people who can not only give support to the student outside of school, but can also provide support for within the school. So the schools are obliged to consider outside evaluations, and it's like people, we have to advocate that people are fully considering those outside reports, but having clinicians working with your students, again, not only do you have the benefit of them getting to know your kid, figuring things out, but also that person can help you advocate for what does the student need, what do they see from their expert opinion, and ideally from their work with your student. So it can be very effective outside and inside school. There are a number of executive functioning researchers out there. I'm a big fan of Guar and Dawson because they look pretty, again, holistically at the executive functioning skills. Here's just a whole big old list. I'm going to highlight a couple in just a second. I'm going to go pretty fast through it. But again, it's something that while if you are discrepant and you are behind, you need instruction. However, executive functioning is not often explicitly taught in schools, other than maybe color-coded folders and using a homework planner to write down your homework. It doesn't usually extend beyond that. Like, again, this metacognition, thinking about what do I know and not know? Thinking about your thinking. So help you review and reflect and make changes for the future. There is one curriculum that I see that's out there, and a number of the schools in the Chicago area use it. It's from Rush. And it's pretty solid. There are a couple other programs and ideas out there, but that curriculum is pretty, again, holistic and pretty comprehensive, and not too bad for districts to implement. Doesn't take too much heavy lifting, so you can throw that out too. And I've actually, with very little lifting, was able to convince districts to adopt Rush curriculum. Didn't work very hard. They were looking for it. So again, metacognition, this idea of what's working, what's not working, and reflecting. And again, really taking advantage of self-awareness that a lot of our students who are twice exceptional have, as Dr. K was sharing. So self-monitoring to task. And here's a big one that I see is that, again, with this beautiful creative mind, creativity, again, Dr. K, you can correct, please, if I'm getting this wrong here, but my experience, my research is talking about that the creative process needs time. And unfortunately, a lot of students who maybe have executive functioning challenges, that idea of thinking ahead and planning ahead is not their go-to. And so maybe they read the directions late and they don't have time for their brain to process. And so I ask a lot of students, you don't have to do it. Just read the directions. Just give your brain some input, let it percolate while you're brushing your teeth, going to bed, whatever. And that'll help your brain have the time to do that creative process. It's a really easy lift. It's a really easy thing. And using resources. My experience, and again, Dr. K, I don't know if this is yours as well, but that a lot of students who are twice exceptional are used to things coming easily to them. And that's part of their identity, is that they learn quickly, they learn thoroughly, and they learn better than everybody else. And so this idea of needing to look outside of their brain doesn't feel right. It feels like I shouldn't do this, it's cheating, I shouldn't need to. When it's like, okay, well, maybe you could spend 8 hours doing that and you could grind it out. But why? This idea of it's smart to be efficient and effective, and using resources is helpful to do that. But boy, oh boy, I have a lot of students who are there's a big wall up, and a lot of it seems to be related to their identity as being a bright student. Do you see that as well, Dr. K?
I do. If there are two things that I could add to this, the first, there was a question about a kiddo being assumed that he should have his words because he's highly verbal to express his frustration. And that's that gap we're talking about, where the intellect, that the emotion and the words of the feelings are living in the intellectual part of that kiddo's mind, but they are not socially and emotionally attached to that vocabulary yet. And that is the intervention. And when there's an assumption from teachers, well, that student should have their words, they should be able to. That's the shift that needs to happen there, is understanding that it's less about somebody not doing it, like digging in their heels, I won't do this. And it's more likely to be, I can't do this because I literally do not know how. And if I did, I would do it. But when we go with the assumption that a kiddo is being stubborn and digging in their heels, we've just lost that opportunity for intervention in exactly the space where they need it. And so what looks like may not be can't. I can't do it. I don't have that skill. I have the knowledge in my mind. I do not have the skill to apply it in an emotional situation. So that's a big opportunity that gets missed with 2E kids. That's kind of the gateway to them being able to do everything else. In executive functioning, you're either managing yourself or you're managing everything else. And if you can't self-manage, it's blocking your ability to use your mind. Another resource, very quick and easy, chapter 4 of my book on unmasking. The book is Teaching to Every Kid's Potential, Simple Neuroscience Lessons to Liberate Learners. The 4 teachings on what a brain would tell us if it could talk about what it needs to be supported and well, and the flexibility, readiness, connection, and the ability to unmask. And that chapter 4 on unmasking, there are 2 tables that define executive function across developmental ages of children, and that also give what are the behaviors, what should they look like at certain ages, but how does specific learning disability impact executive function? How does attention deficit, how does Asperger's, autism, and how does giftedness? And so if you're looking for a very quick and easy grab on all of that complex information, I encourage you to read chapter 4 of my book.
And one of our guests has another idea for a curriculum, an executive function curriculum that some of the CPS high schools use. AVID, A as in apple, V as in Victor, I as in igloo, D as in dog. Advancement via individual determination. Thank you very much for that. Assistive technology is also can be a really key area to help level the playing field. So again, as Dr. K mentioned before, a number of students with twice exceptional have dysgraphia, right? Which, boy, talk about impact on output, right? It's very hard to get your thoughts on paper. And then again, you usually get the behavior and resistance because it's just so laborious. And then again, if you've got that coupled with working memory challenges and processing speed, all of those wonderful thoughts just went away as you were trying painstakingly to get your thoughts out on the paper. Assistive technology can be a game changer, I just really quick story here. I had a student who I started seeing him and working with him in middle school. He was very, very angry. He would not take help. He was reading at a first grade level, very, very angry. And we talked about, let's get him an assessment. Let's look at what's going on. And then they were looking at a couple pieces, and he looked at receptively when he was hearing text, and he was in a place and space where he was open to really getting valid results, right? He was open to really engaging in these tools. And he scored at a 12th grade level, and that changed his life. He went on to college. He went on to say, I need this. I need to be able to hear text. I need to be able to speak it out loud. I just got note he graduated. I'm sorry, it's a lot, right? When you change kids' lives, and his empowerment of I know what I need. And he was able to get it. It made a huge difference. Now, may I strongly encourage you, I know there's a lot of one-to-one technology out there. There's a lot of really Chromebooks and things, and a lot of schools I am seeing are saying, well, this is what we have to offer. Let's use this. Yes, that is a place to start because that's ubiquitous within the environment. The teachers are going to be much more capable of using that. That's what other people are using too. However, if it doesn't meet a student's needs, then that's not appropriate technology. An assistive technology evaluation should start first with what is a student? Where are they at cognitively, motorically? What environments do they need to use this in? So you really need to be thinking about what does this kid need? And then where do we need to be looking at these tools? What is it for? Is it to help you organize? Is it to help to get your thoughts on the paper? Is it to help you think about sensory strategies and implement them in the moment? So many ways, high tech and low tech, like checklists. can level the playing field to make a huge difference. And then the next step is to trial them with meaningful data that it should include the child to see if these are effective tools that we really want to lean into and teach the students how to use, because it's a skill unto itself. What a waste of time to spend a lot of time learning a tool that maybe not good fit for you. But like I said, when you do find those tools that are a good fit and the student understands the efficacy of it, game changer, game changer. And again, schools are responsible for this, and there are many schools have assistive technology coordinators, or the co-ops do. The state does as well. So they can absolutely reach out to the state to get support for how to do an assistive technology evaluation. There are some other private organizations as well that they can contract with. There's plenty of resources for the district to do this right. And then just general tips about going to an IEP, being in the process and working with schools. It is helpful to not go to these meetings alone, just to have somebody else to counter, to help, because it can be a lot, especially if it's your child, to help you make sure you're not missing key information. Ask questions, ask for records. You are allowed access to all of your students' records, or your child's records, short of staff's personal notes. And man, is there some meaty information in there. Talk about like really looking at what's going on here. And boy, there seems to be a pattern to these errors. Let's really dig in here. And then we have our conclusion. Dr. K, do you mind sharing?
No, not at all. So when we think about why should we care about this? Why is this important? We're losing minds if we don't dig into twice exceptionality, if we don't define the complexity in ways that we can work with legally and educationally and medically. We're losing a huge brain trust. We are losing the minds that history talks about as a happenstance. When we look at minds like Einstein's and Churchill's and other greats that did things no one else could do, they kind of did it in spite of their experience, right? And a lot of twice exceptional kids, if they are thriving, they're thriving in spite of their experience, not as a result of. And I think we're living in a day and age where we can do that much more easily, and we should. Thank you
so much. And then just so you all know, there are resources here. And sorry. Me and my tech skills, I apologize here. There we go. And then that's Dr. K. So links to number of just really wonderful resources. And this will be on our Matt Cohen and Associates website shortly. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to wrap it up unless there are any questions. Any additional questions, I should say. All right. Just thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And
Thank you.
Yep. And if anybody wants to ask additional, we've got contact information at the bottom. And again, really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Dr. K.
Have a great afternoon.